a change of subject, sort of a catch your breath, sort of like take a break kind of thing. And that's again a parenthesis. And then it goes to chapter 7, which turns out to have 7 bowls of judgment. So you got seals, trumpets, and bowls. In each case, there's 7. In each case, after the 6th, there's a break before the 7th, and the 7th one really just consists of the next group, if you will. Follow to get the picture. That's a pattern. You realize then this book is highly structured. Highly structured. And there, even in the bowls, there's just one verse, but there's a one verse change of subject before it finishes with bowl number 7, interestingly enough. So that's what they call the heptadic, just the 7-fold structure of the book. And one of the things that are some of us suspect, we don't know, we suspect that John wrote his gospel after the Patmos experience, because you find those heptadic fingerprints all through his gospel. It's just not as obvious. Here it's very manifest. It's almost like a symphony. It's almost like an opera that's been organized. The gospel is not quite that assertive, if you will. So we'll pick it up at chapter 4. Okay, we finished this, presumably we finished the 7 letters. Okay, now we're going to chapter 4, verse 1. After this I looked, and behold, a door was opened in heaven, and the first voice which I heard was as it were of a trumpet talking with me, which said, "Come up hither, and I will show thee things which must be hereafter." And a few verses later it'll say, "And there were 7 lamps of fire burning in the throne." That's a strange phrase, because when you read the book of Revelation, in chapter 1, the last verse of chapter 1 identifies who these 7 lamps are. It's the 7 churches. But now in chapter 4, we find them no longer on the earth, where it was in chapter 1. We find it in heaven. People miss that, but it's I think, a very key indicator. I mention it as a footnote as we go, so you're aware of it. But the main thing here is the first phrase of chapter 4, metatauta, after these things. That's the code word, if you will, that triggers this third major segment of the book. Are we together? Okay. And that's the very thing that which must be hereafter, metatauta. Those things which must be metatauta. Okay, so now we find ourselves with John in the throne room of the universe. Flabbergasting. Now, if you're going to study throne rooms, you're going to want to go to Isaiah 6 and Ezekiel 10 and other places where we get a glimpse of the throne room. But here, this one is from Revelation 4, the throne of God. That's in verses 2 and 3 of chapter 4. And in it we find 24 elders. And there are a lot of everything in the book of Revelation is an allusion from the Old Testament. The book of Revelation consists of 404 verses that includes over 800 allusions from the Old Testament. The reason it sounds strange to us is because we haven't done our homework in the Old Testament. But it turns out that 24 elders are an allusion. We'll come back to that. But every idiom in the book of Revelation is explained somewhere else in the Bible. Those 24 elders that will appear somewhere else in the Bible in some form. And we have the 7 lamps from chapter 1. I just mentioned those. They're on a sea of glass, and I always think this is fascinating because it was a sea of glass. And the sea of glass is what we wash in when we're on the earth. It's what they're standing on it when they're in there. And I think you say that's a pun. Yes, I think it is. I think the Holy Spirit uses figures of speech, and that's one of them. And then we encounter these strange creatures, these 4, King James calls them beasts, and that's unfortunate because it's a different word. We're going to talk about beasts when we get to chapter 13, in beasts in the negative sense. The word that's used here is a different word. It's not a derogatory, it's not a frightening word. It's an alive, good kind of thing. The 4 living creatures, they turn out to be what we call the cherubim. These are super angels, and they're described. They have 4 faces. And those same 4 faces show up all through the Bible in the strangest way. The lion, the calf, the man, and the eagle. In this case, it's the 4 faces of the cherubim. What does that mean? Well, that's a whole area that you can get into if you start getting mystical about the whole thing. But we'll move on. Now, the key to identity, what's going to turn out to be very important to you, is to have no confusion about what is meant by the 24 elders. The 24 seats that are arranged, and these 24 elders come, and they worship God, and they take their crowns and put it on the glassy sea. Who are they? What do they represent? Are there really just 24, or is that just an idiom? Probably. But who are they? Now, the only place you find 24 in the Bible is where David organizes the priesthood into 24 courses. All the priests were in 24 courses, and they changed every Shabbat, and they rotated, and they had a whole procedure. But that's in 1 Chronicles 24, and 19 verses lays it out. That's the only place you'll find 24. It's got nothing to do with 12 disciples. It's got nothing to do with 12 apostles. Many people try to fabricate speculations, and that's fine. But you won't find the number 24 anywhere else. You will find it in another technical place, that there are 24 intervals. Remember when we studied the 70 weeks, we know there's an interval in verse 26 of Daniel 9. That interval that's there shows up surprisingly in other places in the Bible, but they're very subtle. You have to really know how to look for them. But you also discover something very interesting. I think it's interesting. There are 24 of those. 24 intervals. In each case include the church, because the church is in that interval. When you get to the 24, the 70 weeks of Daniel, you got 25 to the triumphal entry. 27 is yet to happen. There's an interval there that includes what we call the church age. Interesting. And that interval shows up in the biblical text 24 times. I wouldn't build our identity of 24 elders on that. I just make it a footnote, a supplemental observation. Now, there are non-Levitical priesthood orders in the Bible, by the way. This is, again, a side thing. Melchizedek being the most startling one. That's worth study, but you need to understand it supersedes all the others. In fact, Jethro he was a priest, and Jacob gives tithes in Genesis 28. We're not sure to whom. That's interesting. But, so anyway, we'll get on here. The 24 elders. Now, fortunately, they identify themselves for us. This isn't a Chuck Missler speculation. I'm just going to call your attention to something that they say. We're going to skip over to chapter 5, verse 9. And it says, and they sung a new song, saying, quote, thou art worthy to take the book and to open the seals thereof, for thou wast slain, and hast redeemed us to God by thy blood out of every kindred and tongue and people and nation, and has made us unto our God kings and priests, and we shall reign on the earth. They identify who they are. They are kings and priests. By the way, they do that in chapter 1. We just didn't go there to start when it kicks off here. But kings and priests, there are only 3 people in the Bible that are called kings and priests. There's some kings and a priest, but there's only 3 people that are both a king and a priest. Okay? The first, of course, is Melchizedek, because he's an archetype of that. The second, of course, is Jesus. He's a king and a priest. Well, who's the third? He's sitting in these seats. We are. How do I know that? All through the epistles, Paul mentions that. But here, it says, because thou hast redeemed us. See that us? Thou hast redeemed us to God by thy blood out of every kindred and tongue and people and nation, and hast made us unto our God kings and priests, and we shall reign on. So who are the 24 elders? They represent in the composite the redeemed. What we commonly call the church in the mystical sense. Somebody was asking me earlier today, give me an example of the Hebrew sod. Well, that would be one of them, I think. The concept of the ecclesia. If we use the word church, we get confused. We think of real estate because we use that term in another way. If you think of the ecclesia, the saved collectively, that's interesting. Okay, let's get back to chapter 5 at the beginning, starting chapter verse 1. John says, I saw in the right hand of him that sat on the throne a scroll written within and on the backside, sealed with 7 seals. And I just noticed, by the way, for the first time as I was looking at the little title slide I often use, you've seen me with that little scroll. If you look at it closely, it's written within and on the backside, which means it's a title deed. But we'll go on here. And John says, I saw a strong angel proclaiming with a loud voice, who is worthy to open the scroll and to loose the seals thereof? That call goes out, okay? And it says, and no man in heaven, nor in earth, neither under the earth, was able to open the scroll, neither to look thereon. Wow. Now you and I are puzzled what's going on. We're wondering what's going on. John understood. Why? How do I know? Because the next line says, John says, I sobbed convulsively. I wept much, because no man was found worthy to open and to read the scroll, neither to look thereon. Wow. You see, there's a subtlety here that was required that we don't pick up on. Okay? It had to be a man. It had to be a kinsman of Adam to be eligible. And no man was found worthy. And John realized the desperate situation of that. You and I miss it because you don't have the background. John understood. He says, I sobbed convulsively. Why? Because no man was found worthy. Fortunately, there's an exception that's going to be pointed out to him. But that's the predicament. Are we together? Okay. It's interesting how when he's up there in heaven and there's something on the earth that needs explanation, the elders explain it to him. Excuse me, if it's on the earth, the cherubim explain it to him. If there's something going on in heaven he doesn't understand, the elders explain it to him. You'll notice it's always some cases it's an elder explaining, other cases it's a cherubim explaining. Anyway. And one of the elders said unto me, weep not. Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, hath prevailed to open the book and to loose the 7 seals thereof. So John's obviously relieved. He turns and he looks. And I beheld, and lo, in the midst of the throne and the 4 living creatures, and in the midst of the elders, stood the Lamb as it had been slain. Wow. He was told it was a lion, root of David. No, he turns and looks. It's not a lion. It's a lamb. Because the idiom goes to the very title that John the Baptist used when in the first public appearance of Christ by the Jordan. Behold the Lamb of God that taketh away the sin of the world. That's a Jewish title. And that's the title used here. So the Lamb as it has been slain, having 7 horns, 7 eyes. That's an idiom for the Holy Spirit, which are the 7 spirits of God sent forth. It's interesting how the 7 spirits, it draws from Isaiah 11. Again and again, the 7 spirits are a way of referring to what you and I summarize as the Holy Spirit, as a person. The Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, that's his expectation. He turns and sees the lambs that had been slain. Wow. A couple of things to highlight that I want you to carry away in your notes. The 24 elders are in heaven worshiping the Lamb before he receives the scroll. Understand that? They're there before the scroll is given. Okay? It's when the Lamb and he has the unique right to open it. And by the way, if he's the one opening the scroll, he's not one of the seals. You follow me? I'll get to that in a minute. But his opening the seals, his opening of the seals, that sets the 4 horsemen into motion. So understand those 4 horsemen are set in motion after we are in heaven. It's astonishing how many people stumble over that. They don't get it. It's pretty straightforward and fundamental. Okay, the opening of the seal gold. Okay, so verse 1, it says, and I saw the Lamb when the Lamb opened one of the seals, and I heard as it were a noise of thunder, and one of the 4 beasts, actually one of the 4 living creatures is what it should say, it's one of the cherubim, said, come and see. And I saw and behold a white horse, and he that sat on him had a bow, and a crown was given unto him. And he went forth conquering and to conquer. Okay, good. So that's the first of the 4 seals. Are we together so far? We'll read through just to get the flavor of the next one here. The second seal is the red horse, which represents wars. And when it opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, come and see. And there went out another horse that was red, and power was given to him that sat thereon to take peace from the earth, that they should kill one another. And there was given unto him a great sword. Wow. So that's the second one, the red horse. And then the third one's the black horse, which speaks of famine and inflation. And when he had opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, "Come and see." And I beheld, and lo, a black horse, and he that sat on him had a pair of balances in his hand, measuring something here. And black is often connected with famine, of course. To eat bread by weight is an indictment from Leviticus 26 and other places. And I heard a voice in the midst of the four beasts say, "A measure of wheat for a penny, 3 measures of barley for a penny, and see thou hurt not the oil and the wine." Scarcity, famine, that's the overtone. There's more, but we'll get into that when the time comes. Okay, so we have white, red, and black. There's one more to come here. The livid horse, the pale horse. The actual word in the Greek implies chloros. It means green, but it's a ugly kind of green. Speaking of death, naturally. And when he'd opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, "Come and see." And I looked, and behold, a pale horse. And his name that sat on him was Death. And hell followed after him. And power was given unto them over a fourth part of the earth, to kill with the sword, and with hunger, and with death, and with the beasts of the earth. And those beasts are not necessarily 4-footed. They can be microscopic, but they're beasts nonetheless. So that's the fourth one. Okay? Ezekiel 14, we have an interesting verse. It says, "Thus saith the Lord God, how much more when I send my 4 sore judgments upon Jerusalem, the sword, the famine, the noisome beast, the pestilence, and cut off from it man and beast." Wow. There's something else I'd like to highlight, we're just this sort of the warm-up. We'll get to the one we're really after in a minute. But it's interesting to contrast Revelation 6, the whole bunch, and Matthew 24. In Revelation 6, you have the white horse and rider. You have a red horse in war. You've got the black horse for famine. You've got pale horse for death. You'll have the martyrs that will follow, and then you have the worldwide chaos that comes at next. It's interesting, in Matthew 24, you have false Christ to begin with. You've got wars, famines, death, martyrs, and worldwide chaos in the same order. You notice that. There's a parallelism that's, I suspect, deliberate. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think it's designed that way. Now, there's another thing I'll call your attention to that may just be a coincidence, but it's still too curious not to mention it to you. The white, red, black, and green are on all the flags of Islam. What do you do with that? I don't know. I wouldn't make too much of it, but it's too curious not to make you at least aware of it, for what it's worth. The heptadic structure. Got a 7-seal scroll, and you've got the 7 trumpets, again, with each one with their parenthesis, and the 7 bowls of judgment. Okay? Fair enough. So that's it. We're going to zero in, of course, on the 4 seals. White, red, black, and green. The 4 horsemen. In fact, what really has brought us together, this was all sort of a warm-up. We are going to look at, behold the white horse. And it may surprise you that I regard him as the mistaken identity. It astonishes me to see how many commentators miss the whole point of what he's all about. Why a white horse? John 5:43 says, Jesus said to them, in John chapter 5, verse 43, he says, "I have come in my Father's name, you receive me not. Another will come in his own name, and him you will receive." You're going to make a mistake, in other words. A mistaken identity. See, this rider of this white horse is not Christ. How do I know? Well, first of all, he's in bad company. Look at the 3 guys riding with him. That's not Christ. Furthermore, Christ is the one that's opening the seals. He's not a subject of one of the seals. But this guy that's coming will resemble and imitate Christ. That's the point. And he does it so well that there are many commentators that don't pick up on it. They're also fooled. Furthermore, this one is called forth by the living creatures. That's not appropriate for them to call Christ forward. He's their creator. No. So, and there's going to be a lot said about his career. We'll get into that here shortly. So back to, I saw when the Lamb opened one of the seals, and I heard as it were the noise of thunder, one of the four living creatures said, "Come and see." That's not quite what he said. He actually said, "Proceed." Your King James called it "come." Erko in the Greek is actually call forth. He's ordered by one of the four living creatures. And remember, Jesus is the one opening the seals in the first place. Behold, a white horse. Why a horse? We got all these horses. Horses are often used to designate judgments, like a force or like a tithe, in a sense. And there's lots of examples in your notes. You can track those down and come to your own conclusions. But here, apparently, one of his key characteristics is that he had a bow. Of all the things to mention, that's singled out. Two things are mentioned, a bow and a crown, but the bow is mentioned. And most people jump to the conclusion that that's an archery term. Not necessarily. Not necessarily. A bow versus a sword, for an example. The Hebrew is kesheth. In the Greek translation, it's a toxon, which is a bow. And it's not necessarily a tool of archery. That's a very common presumption. It's understandable. But there's something else you need to be aware of that exegetes will highlight to you, and that's what's called the law of first mention. When something is mentioned the first time in the Bible, it turns out to be significant and it has a unique relevance. Let's take a look at those. Law of first mention. The word love. Where's the first place that the word love appears? God uses to Abraham about his son. Because his son is going to be acting out a type of God's son. Because another father is going to offer his son. And that's what Abraham's going to act out, in effect. And he knows he is, by the way. He knows he's acting out prophecy because he names the place prophetically. And Hebrews 11:19 highlights that. So that's love as an example. The first place love shows is where it's referring to the Son of God, and in the context of giving himself to all of us. Wow. What could be more appropriate? The word man, okay, and is that man was made in the image of God. First place man appears is where he's being made in the image of God. Is that relevant? I sure think so. Well, what about this bow business? Well, in chapter 9, verse 13 is the first mention of it. God says, "I do set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be for a token of a covenant between me and the earth." See, you and I don't associate it as a token of a covenant. God does several times. It's a token of a covenant. How interesting it is as we really begin to understand the white horseman, the key event in his life is making a covenant that gets him to power and then breaking it. That's going to be a major element of his career we'll get into. The bow, the covenant and its breaking is a key identity for him. And we'll see that go. Amos 2:15, "Neither shall he stand that handleth the bow, and he that is swift of foot shall not deliver himself. Neither shall he that rideth the horse deliver himself." Interesting little allusions here you find when you're watching for them. Okay? And so, the bow. See, the bow seems to symbolize, in addition, the first world leader, which was Nimrod, the hunter. It was a symbol, apparently. And also the final world leader will have the same symbol. He's also an Assyrian. So both the first and last Assyrian seem to be identified together. But when we get to Daniel chapter 9, probably one of the most important, the last 4 verses of Daniel 9 is what Jesus points his disciples to when they ask him about the end times. In the Mount of Olives, 4 guys came to him, Peter, James, and John, and Andrew, Peter's brother. They come and they ask him some questions, and he gives them a briefing, which we call the Olivet Discourse, because it's on the Mount of Olives at night, but that's no big deal, per se, just a label. But in those 4 verses, the last verse talks about a week of years. That's pivotal. And it says, "He shall confirm the covenant with the many for 1 week." The last week of years. It's the 70th week of a group of 70. "And in the midst of the week, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And for the overspreading of abominations, he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation. And that determined shall be poured upon the desolate." Now, this isn't the place to try to unravel the whole 70 weeks. But if you haven't done it, you need to desperately really understand the 70-week prophet, the last 4 verses of Daniel 9. And that's a study in its own right. I'm assuming that's a review for most of you. But this leader, this world leader, is going to achieve power because he's going to eventually be able to enforce the covenant or confirm the covenant with Israel. The many is an idiom there of Israel. He shall enforce the covenant with the many for 1 week. Okay? That's his commitment. Except, you see, that by the way, it appears to involve temple sacrifice and so as we'll see in a minute. But in the midst of the week, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. So whatever that covenant includes, it may be a lot of other things too, but we know it apparently includes their permission to return to sacrifice their Jewish sacraments. In the midst of the week, he shall cause sacrifice and oblation to cease. So in the middle of the week, these are weeks of years, he abrogates that covenant. That's a big deal in his life. Jesus is going to point to that when we get to Matthew. Jesus is going to make a big thing of that. We'll get there in a minute. He shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. So his enforcement of the covenant seems to include a return to the temple sacrifices for some weird reason. And for the overspreading, that's what we call the abomination of desolation. That's a term that Jesus used. We'll see in just a minute. Abomination is a form of idol worship. And the extreme version of that is to put an idol in the most sacred place on the planet Earth, in the temple, in fact, in the Holy of Holies. And we know that because there was a historical event that Jesus makes reference to in using that term. And so this is the very marker that Jesus calls the attention of the disciples to in the Olivet Discourse. The abomination. So we'll get to that. Let's take a look at it. When you get to Matthew 24, there's a whole bunch of things that are mentioned before you get to verse 15. Wars and rumors of wars and earthquakes and divers, all those things. He says, but the end is not yet. Those things are lumped and then described as not being signs. Strange. We always see those lists of signs. No, he lists those things that they're coming, but they're not signs because they're not distinctive enough to be a sign. However, when you get to verse 15, he said, by then he says these things are not signs. When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation, which one? Spoken of by Daniel the prophet. He's talking about chapter 9, right here. Stand in the holy place. Whoso readeth, let him understand. Wow, there's a lot in this one verse is a big deal. We could spend an hour on this little verse. Okay. You got all these critics that like to argue who really wrote Daniel. I know who wrote Daniel. How do I know? Jesus told me. Daniel the prophet. Anybody that wants to challenge has got bigger problems than the authorship of Daniel. And when you see the abomination of desolation, spoken by Daniel the prophet, stand where? In the holy place. In fact, the Holy of Holies is where it is. And then he adds this little phrase, whoso readeth, let him understand. How many of you read that with me just now? Can I see a show of hands? Do you realize you just picked up an obligation? Jesus said, whoso readeth, let him understand. You now do not have the option of not bringing that to understanding. You need to dig into that till you understand it. Because Jesus tells you to. That's not a little peripheral thing that good people have different views about. No, that's something that you need to understand. Jesus says so. Okay? It's the key event in the Olivet Discourse. That abomination, that event, the putting up of an idol in the Holy of Holies is what it's talking about, is going to puncture that 70th week right in the middle. There was 7 years set aside by the world leader that's going to be violated. He's not going to keep his covenant. He's going to violate that covenant. That's exactly what Antiochus Epiphanes did back in 167 BC. That very thing. He made a covenant and he violated right in the middle. The pattern was there. By the way, see, this is no longer optional. You've got to do your homework now. Okay? But there's something else here. Did you realize that there's a technology statement in here? I want you to be alert to technology statements. I'm sure if Dwayne Madsen was among us, he would insist, as he's our enterprise architect, and he would insist that we always pay attention where there's evidences of design. Well, there's a technology statement here. Do you see it? When ye therefore shall see the abomination. How can you see something that's in the Holy of Holies? If you're in the mountains of Judæa, or you're by the Sea of Galilee, or wherever you are, how can you see an event that's going on inside the Holy of Holies? You can only enter the Holy of Holies once a year if you're the high priest, only once a year, and after great ceremonial preparation. No one's allowed in there. But apparently, when ye therefore shall see this thing happen, how are you going to see it? Anyone? On CNN or BBC. It's going to be televised. It's a big event, apparently. It's going to get public attention. And when you see that happen, oh boy, you get some instructions to follow here. What do? Then let them which be in Judæa, not in the holy place, them which be in Judæa, flee into the mountains. Let him which is in the housetop not come down to take anything out of the... Realize the housetop was typically the guard. It was on a hillside. So often your roof is at street level. So if you're leaving, you leave from the roof, strangely. He that's on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house. The Missler translation is, you split and you split now. Neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. And woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. And pray that your flight be not in winter, neither on the Sabbath day. That tells you something about his audience. He's assuming his audience is Jewish. If it was Sabbath day, it wouldn't bother us. No, he's assuming he's talking to Jews. It's talking to Jews. Luke 21 is not. That's during the day in the temple. It's a different, very similar, but very different presentation with a different conclusion. Many people think Luke 21 is part of the Olivet Discourse. No. But let's move on here. For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. He's quoting from Daniel 12, actually. But he is labeling the last half of that 7-year period. It's split in the middle by the abomination of desolation. 3.5 years before, 3.5 years after. He labels the last half the great tribulation. Where does it get that label? From Jesus here in Matthew 24. For then shall be great tribulation, such as not since the beginning of the world to this time, nor ever would shall be. You mean to tell me it's going to be worse than the Nazi Holocaust? Absolutely. By a factor of 2 to 1. How do I say that? The first Holocaust, we know from World War II, took apparently about 1 Jew in 3. About 1/3 of Jewry perished in so-called Holocaust. Zechariah 13:9 says the next one will take 2 out of 3. And because I read that on the radio, the Anti-Defamation League has labeled me an anti-Semite. I think they've corrected that. I think they've got enough mail that straightened that out. But in any case, not on the Sabbath day. He's speaking to a Jewish audience. And the Great Tribulation, he labels the last half, the 3.5 years, the 42 months, the 12. Each half is labeled every way you could think of. Half a week, 3.5 years, 42 months, 1,260 days. The Holy Spirit did everything but put it in nanoseconds for you. And then you get to verse 22. This is another one that I just don't want you to miss. Jesus says, except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. Do you realize that's a technology statement? If we were studying this, say, in 1860, roughly the time of the Civil War in the United States, if we were at that period studying this, would we understand this? Probably not. We could not imagine the world wiping itself out with muskets and bayonets. No, this is a technology statement that says it'll be in our capability of wiping us totally out. Except those days be short, there should no flesh be saved. That's a technology statement. And we today, the nuclear cloud hangs over every geopolitical decision made on the planet Earth. The reality of that. Back in the days of mutually assured destruction, we had 2 players, the U.S. and Russia. The nightmare scenario in those days was what we used to call the nth country problem. What happens when there's more than 2, 3, 4? There's a plurality. That was regarded as a nightmare because that's a study of coalitions and what have you. And that's where we are today. There are a number of countries that have nuclear weapons, not just Russia and the U.S. There's a number of them. Whether it's 5 or 8, you can argue. I won't get into that here. We'll talk about that next time. And Jesus says, he goes on to say, then if any man should say unto you, lo, here is Christ, or there, believe it not, or there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible, they shall deceive